Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about deployment strategies for OpsWorks. Now, we have a few different options, and we're going to talk about each in depth and also the pros and cons of each. And it'll give you a good idea of the use cases for each and what requirements they fit, and this will serve you well on the DevOps Professional Certification exam. In the DevOps Doctrine, let's click Deployment Strategies. Now, the three strategies available to us are manual, rolling, and blue-green. And we'll get in depth on each of these in a few moments. But before that, let's go over to the AWS Management Console and go into OpsWorks, and we'll just create a stack. And once this stack is built, it will assist us during the lesson. So let's click Add your first stack. And we'll just go with the Chef 11 stack. We'll keep all of the defaults. Let's click Add Stack. All right. Now, in doing this, a little bit of repetition on this stack creation will not hurt you either. So our next step is to add a layer. And remember, we can add multiple layers to our stack. We're just going to add one. We'll add a PHP app server layer. Now, once we have a layer or layers, we can add instances to those layers. So let's go ahead and do that. And it defaults to C3 large. We'll just go with a T2 micro. And let's add an instance. Now, we've added an instance. Now we have to start the instance. While our instance is booting up, let's go back to the lesson. So one of the key points with deploying updates to your OpsWorks stacks is that these updates are deployed from a remote repository, GitHub or Subversion or wherever you keep your code. So updating the repo will automatically update newly launched instances, but not running instances. So there's an opportunity for inconsistency there. And to avoid this inconsistency, we can work with software branching techniques. So rather than update the master branch of our repo, we can instead use tagging to explicitly define the approved source version. Another thing we can do is use Amazon S3. So we can package our code in S3 and using that as the source for our apps and cookbooks. Now, what's the advantage of that? Well, we can turn versioning on for S3. So we can store and maintain multiple versions of our app in S3. So let's talk about our options for OpsWorks deployments. And the first one is a manual deploy. So with a manual deploy, we just update code to existing instances by running the deploy command for apps and the update custom cookbook command for cookbooks. And the deploy command deploys application code and other related files to application instances all at the same time. So remember that, all at the same time. That should start raising some flags. And we'll talk about pros and cons in a second here. Now remember also that the deploy command runs automatically as part of a lifecycle event, but it can be executed manually, which we are about to do. And we could also use custom recipes to bootstrap our instances. So again, going back to the keywords, deploys application code to instances all at the same time. So what are the pros and cons of that? Well, it's fast. That is the pro of this method. And we'll see that in a second. So what are the cons? Well, updating all instances at the same time itself is a con, because if you have an error during the update, you're going to have some downtime. So there's risk reward. It's quick, but you're risking some downtime if you run into any problems. But you're storing versions and you can roll back. Let's go back over to the management console and we see our instance is now ready. So let's go into apps and we're going to add an app. And the one thing we need to do is specify our repository. And we can click Add App. URL was wrong. Let's click Add App. All right. And this is what we're talking about with a manual deploy. So we've added our app, and the next step is to deploy that app. So a basic set of steps for OpsWorks stacks is you add the stack, you add your layers, add instances to those layers, add your app, and finally you deploy the app. Now this holds true also for updates. And this is our manual deploy. So let's go ahead and click deploy. And note, our command is deploy. Now that's one of our lifecycle events. Check this out. So we can deploy manually, we can undeploy, and we can do a rollback. Now, if we deploy our app and we have an error, remember, deploy does everything at once, so we have a problem here. We need to roll back and roll back quickly. Well, this is where you would do it. Now, undeploy is different. Undeploy is going to remove every version of your application. So when would you use this? Well, maybe you're changing from PHP to Node.js. You would do an undeploy that's going to remove every version of your application so your instance is totally clean, and then you can redeploy your new app. But we just need to do a deploy, so let's go ahead and click deploy, and our application is being deployed. Now, if we had multiple instances, this deployment is going to all of those instances at once. So it's kind of all or nothing. If it succeeds, we're good and we go forward. If not, we roll back quickly. All right, now notice that our deployment was successful and it took 45 seconds, so that's pretty quick. Now, if we had a problem, as we saw, we can roll back pretty quickly as well. Now, with OpsWorks, we can roll back up to 4 previous versions. OpsWorks saves the 5 most recent deployments. Now, if for some reason you need more versions, well, you can use S3 and use S3 versioning and hold more than 5. All right, so that's a manual deployment. Now let's talk about rolling deployments. And the principles of this are the same as for our auto-scaling rolling deployments. So we use the rolling deployments with OpsWorks to deploy updates in multiple phases. Each phase updates a group of instances and verifies that the update was successful. If the update was successful, the next phase of instances is updated. And this process continues until all instances are updated. So what are the pros of that? Well, just like with our auto-scaling rolling updates, we can prevent downtime. So we're not doing the all at once. Another pro is it does not require doubling resource capacity, and we'll talk about that when we talk about blue-green deployment strategies. Now, what are some of the cons? Well, failed deployments reduce capacity and require redeployment to affected instances. Let's say we were doing a rolling deployment and we updated a couple instances and were successful, and then we ran into an error. Some of our instances are going to be updated and some not, and we have that unbalanced situation. So we're going to have to roll back from that. All right, so how do we actually implement rolling deployments? So we deregister one of our instances from the load balancer, and then we can deploy the app to that instance. So it's not going to be serving any traffic yet. It's deregistered. We then check if the update was successful. We can check this manually. We can rely on health checks or both. So once we have a successful update, we register the instance back to the load balancer and then move on to the next batch of instances. Now, on a failed update, we just have to roll back that instance. And we would continue this process until all the instances are updated. Now, one thing we can use with our Elastic Load Balancer is connection draining. So our load balancer is making sure it's waiting for our users to end their sessions on that instance, and then it will deregister the instance after those connections have drained. Okay, so that's rolling deployments. Now let's talk about blue-green deployments. And with blue-green deployments, we're creating separate stacks. So this is the case where we are doubling the number of instances. Now, if cost isn't a concern, this is a great deployment strategy. But as you can see, when you double the instances, you're introducing that cost. So when thinking about these methods and as relates to the DevOps certification exam, always think about these types of trade-offs and your requirements and what use cases these fit. So if cost is not your overriding factor, blue-green might be the way to go. Now, one pattern that is great for blue-green deployments is your typical application lifecycle, where you may have a development stack, a staging stack, and a production stack. Your developers, of course, develop on that development stack. You can have your staging stack, do some testing. You could have a test stack. And finally, you want to move this code ultimately to the production stack. Now, your existing production stack is the blue stack. And you're going to have a new production stack, and we're calling that the green stack. On the green stack, your code goes through this production lifecycle. Dev, staging, move to production. So you're ready to go with your green stack. So what do? Well, you switch your traffic from the blue stack to the green stack. How would you do that? You probably know where this is going. AWS Route 53, we point DNS to the green stack. We can also use weighted routing. So we can gradually switch over. We can switch we can send a percentage of our traffic to the green stack. And as we become more sure of its success, we keep increasing this traffic level until we're completely switched over. So what are some of the pros of the blue-green deployment strategy? Well, we can keep that blue environment until we are certain that the green environment is successful. So we're going to prevent downtime, and failed deployments can be rolled back by swapping back to the blue environment. Another pro is that a small subset of users are affected by failed deployments since we use weighted routing. Now, what are some of the cons? Well, mainly the cost. So remember, we're doubling capacity while both environments are running. And also we're using DNS changes, which are not always reliable, and there's that time factor in syncing up. I like to think of these strategies kind of on a spectrum, and how they correlate to the use cases and or requirements we may encounter when we get scenario questions on the DevOps Pro Cert, or more importantly, in the real world. So this manual deployment strategy is the fastest. Your keywords for this are speed, but an anti-pattern for the manual deployment is if you can't afford downtime. So there's a risk reward with manual deployment. Rolling deployment prevents against downtime. And it might be a case of best of both worlds. Maybe you also have a cost element where you don't want to double your number of instances. So no downtime and a cost factor, maybe it's rolling deployments. Now with blue-green, there's that cost factor. But if cost is not your limiter, blue-green is a great deployment strategy. So going through this lesson and all of the lessons, really, always try to think about how these techniques correlate to the requirements that you're going to be given. For a little bit more information, let's go click on Key Concepts. And we see the information we covered on rolling deployment and also blue-green. But finally, we'll wrap up just talking about some other techniques. And one of those is we can use CloudFormation with OpsWorks. We can use CloudFormation to map out stack components, and we can easily create multiple environments. And this is key. We can version control those environments. Another thing we can do with CloudFormation is, let's say that we have a database and we don't want our database to change during deployments. Well, we can just use CloudFormation to create this database. And let's not forget about pre-baked AMIs. So we can bake custom AMIs to speed up deployments and updates, instead of having to configure and initialize instances from scratch each time. And we saw this, that takes a few minutes. we can bake custom images that hold core parts of our application. So this can speed up our deployments. Another thing we can do is we can use Docker containers. They can include all or some of the required packages and configurations. All right, so let's go back to our diagram. Just to close out the lesson, our 3 deployment strategies. Manual. The upside is it's fast. Downside is you're introducing the possibility of some downtime. Rolling deployment sits in the middle of this spectrum, so it can avoid downtime. It's not quite as fast as manual. And the advantage of rolling over blue-green is that rolling does not double the size of your instances. Blue-green, the downside is potential cost. Because you are doubling the number of instances, you're also doubling your elastic load balancer. But if cost is not your overriding factor, blue-green could be a great deployment strategy. And with that, we have completed this lesson. Go ahead and mark it complete, and let's move on.